right now we're going to be talking about cognition, depression, and anxiety and how to manage them with Dr. Mark Mapstone. Mark Mapstone is a professor of neurology at the University of California, Irvine School of Medicine. He's a member of the UCI Institute for Memory Impairments and Neurological Disorders and a fellow of the UCI Center for Neurobiology of Learning and Memory. His research focuses on preclinical detection of neurological disease using cognitive tests and biomarkers obtained from blood. He has a special interest in developing strategies to maintain successful cognitive aging. Mark has spoken on this topic for us multiple times, and it is still one of our favorite talks. I learn something new every time I hear it. So I'm really, really happy to have you here today. Mark.
All right. Well, thank you.
Let's try the screen, and if not, I can pull it up on mine.
Okay, so here we go with my screen.
There we go.
Does that work?
Yep.
Let's make sure that we can get into slideshow.
There we go. Perfect.
Okay, good. Well, good morning, everyone in Troy, Michigan, or wherever you are. Greetings from Southern California. I'm going to be talking today about some what I think are important issues in this primary motor disorder that we know of as Parkinson's disease. And we're going to be talking about cognition and mood, particular depression and anxiety. And then I'm going to end up with some tips on how we might be proactive and address some of these things. But first, I want to just emphasize something that the introduction mentioned is I'm a clinical neuropsychologist. And what that means is that I'm somebody who studies and specializes in the study of how the brain produces behavior. And we may or may not be part of your care team. But for many of you, it would be helpful to have somebody like me to weigh in if you're having these particular problems that I'm going to be talking about today. Their neuropsychologists are available at most major medical centers, but not all. So there aren't tons of us around, but we are out there. But the important thing that I want to emphasize today, and if you take home one point about the entire presentation, it's that if you're having these problems that I'm going to discuss just now, it's important for you to talk to your doctor. The person who's treating you, he or she can get you the help that you need, because you don't have to live with these problems. Many times there are things that can be done, and it's important because it can substantially affect your quality of life. So if you leave with one thing today and you're leaving right now and you're not going to listen to me anymore, know that these are things that are addressable. And it's important for you to discuss them with your doctor. These are not things to be ashamed of. These are not things that you have to hide from others. These are recognized features of the syndrome and something you want to pay attention to. So that's the topic. Before I get started, I want to take just a brief second here to tell you about where I get my sources of income and funding for my research. I'm primarily a researcher, and these are the different various sources where I receive funding to do my research. I'm looking for ways to diagnose and treat Parkinson's disease and other cognitive disorders like Alzheimer's disease, and also different ways to diagnose it. So these are the different places where I get funding to do that. And this is important for you to know, because when I give you information, it's important for you to know if there are biases in the way that I'm presenting things. I don't think that there are, but here's everything that you need to know about me. Let's start at the beginning. And I always like to start off with this sort of a slide to just sort of let you all know that Parkinson's disease and the symptoms of Parkinson's disease have been recognized for many centuries. And it was in the 1815 when James Parkinson first wrote this essay called an essay on the shaking palsy, which you can see down here. This is James Parkinson. I hope you can see my pointer on the screen, but this is James Parkinson. And this is the essay that he wrote in a medical journal, which he called the Essay on the Shaking Palsy. Here he describes a number of cases, that is, descriptions of individuals that he noticed while walking around and practicing in London. And he noticed people on the street who had a particular kind of gait and motor presentation that you can see here in this individual, the stooped gait and the sort of flexed posture that you see. And he decided that this was something that he wanted to describe to the medical literature so that we could understand it better. And he prominently described the things that were outwardly noticeable. That is the motor features, the things that he noticed with people's movement who had this syndrome. And he described, of course, the cardinal features that we know of tremor, rigidity, and bradykinesia. Bradykinesia, if you break down that word, means brady slowness, kinesia movement. So slowness of movement, bradykinesia. So people with Parkinson's disease, as you all well know, move slowly. And this is an important phenomenon because we're going to talk about that because it applies also to thinking. So it's not only affecting slowness of movement, but also slowness of thinking. And that's an important thing to know about. And he finally described the last major feature, which is gait and balance problems. And it really wasn't until many decades later, at the end of the 19th century, that people started to notice that not only were there motor features of this disease, meaning there was things wrong with the movement, but there were also some subtle cognitive or thinking changes. And it wasn't until about the 1890s in a lecture in Paris that a prominent researcher noted that there was what he called a feebleness of the mind, in the sense that the patient and his or her friends no longer recognized who he was. And in that description, the lecturer was getting at this subtle cognitive changes that with advancing Parkinson's disease started to manifest themselves. And so it was really quite a bit later after the initial motor presentation and description that people soon began to recognize that there were also these other non-motor features. And as a matter of fact, as the 20th century and now into the 21st century, we're really recognizing that there are a lot of these other motor features, non-motor features. In this pie chart here, you can see, I've highlighted here the motor features, but there are also these other features that I'm going to address today: cognitive, neuropsychiatric, and in particular, I'm talking about mood and personality, but also sleep and autonomic features. Autonomic meaning things like problems with your blood pressure, problems with different sort of other neural functions that aren't related to motor function. And if you look at this table here, you can see that the percentage of patients who actually have these non-motor features is really quite high. The olfactory problems with the sense of smell and often taste, a vast majority of patients have that as a feature. Dementia can be high. We're going to talk about that. Depression is also up to half of people with Parkinson's disease have some sort of depression. Autonomic dysfunction, orthostatic, this is low blood pressure, GI symptoms, etc. So you can see that there's a majority of patients in many cases are going to experience these other non-motor features. And so while we have a very good recognition of the motor symptoms of the disease, these non-motor features are really important to recognize, and I'm going to go through some of them today. Suffice to say that I don't have enough time to go into all of these in detail. I could spend an entire semester, and I do with my medical students, going over these non-motor features of Parkinson's and Alzheimer's disease. So we can spend a lot of time going into these, and I don't have that today, but I'm going to highlight the ones that I think are most relevant, and that's going to be cognition or thinking abilities, and mood, in particular depression and anxiety. But in order to understand why these symptoms happen, and in fact the motor symptoms as well, I want to give you a very quick rundown of basic biology so that you can understand why these problems are happening. So I'm going to take you all the way back to high school biology. If you remember in 10th grade, if you were paying attention in class, neurons are the cells in your brain that are really the workhorses of the brain. They do all of the heavy lifting. They do all of the things that make us uniquely human. They allow us to move and to think and to feel emotions and to plan and make decisions. Everything that happens in the way that we behave is a result of neural activity, neurons talking to each other. And they communicate with each other using electricity, but also chemicals. And in particular, there's an important chemical called dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter. It's a chemical that the neurons use to talk to each other. So neighboring neurons will talk to each other through this chemical called dopamine. As you know, neurons, we have many of them. We have billions of them in our brain. And these neurons are connected together in large networks, sort of like the highway system in a city, so that different networks operate in different parts of the brain and they control certain behaviors. So one network or one highway might get you from point A to point B, and it might control your motor abilities. But it's another highway that's in a different part of town might control your thinking abilities. Anyway, all of these highways are connected to each other somehow, but they're all doing certain jobs. Different parts of the brain have these different areas of specialization. And we're going to be talking primarily about the frontal lobes of the brain today. That's these areas here. If you imagine that your eyeball is here and you're looking this way, this is the frontal lobe of the brain. And this is where we're going to be focusing much of our attention today. The important thing to know about this biology lesson is that that chemical dopamine is the chemical, the neurotransmitter that's depleted or low in people with Parkinson's disease. And dopamine is a fundamental chemical that allows neurons to talk to each other. So when you have low levels, then those areas of the brain and those neurons that require the dopamine can't do their job appropriately. And as a result, you get the symptoms of the disease. So dopamine is required for smooth movements and planning of movements. And so this is why if there's a lack of dopamine in the brain, that you can't move well. Well, in a similar vein, if there's a lack of dopamine and other neurotransmitters in the brain, your brain is not going to be able to think well as also. So this is a picture here on the bottom of the different these are pathways of dopamine and acetylcholine and serotonin. These are different neurotransmitters. But down here is a picture of a DAT scan, which shows the presence of dopamine, basically, in someone with Parkinson's disease and someone who doesn't have Parkinson's disease. You have two very similar structures on the two sides of your brain. And this is the basal ganglia. This is a putamen. And you can see the person with Parkinson's disease has smaller areas of red here than someone who doesn't have Parkinson's disease. This person here without Parkinson's disease has normal levels of dopamine. This person with Parkinson's has lower levels of dopamine. And it's because of those lower levels of dopamine that all of these broad symptoms in Parkinson's disease are manifest. And we're very familiar with the motor symptoms, but these chemicals also play an important role in non-motor abilities. So this biology lesson was really just to show you that the symptoms that you're experiencing in Parkinson's disease are a result of a biological problem, and that is the lack of dopamine and other chemicals in the brain. So the premotor phase of Parkinson's disease is an increasingly recognized phase, and this is where symptoms that are not motor precede the motor symptoms. That is to say that these cognitive symptoms and these non-motor symptoms actually start occurring way before the tremor starts to appear, or the stiffness, or the rigidity, or the bradykinesia. You may have trouble with sense of smell, acting out in your sleep, excessive sleepiness, or mood disorders and other GI problems well before, many years, probably maybe even decades, before you get that first tremor. So if you think back to your own personal history or your person with Parkinson's personal history, it may be that some of these premotor symptoms actually occurred before the motor symptoms did. And so this is an increasingly recognized stage, because if we can find these things in people, that might be a very good time to start some drugs or some therapies that might be able to slow down the progression of the disease. At this point, we don't really have great drugs for that last for a long time and actually change the course of the disease. The drugs that we have are actually really just to change the amounts of dopamine in the brain primarily and change the symptoms. But there's nothing that's changing the loss of that dopamine. These non-motor symptoms are very important because they can significantly and critically impact your quality of life. They affect the majority of patients, as we saw earlier, up to 90%, so a vast majority. And they're usually fairly mild early in the course of the disease, but they do increase as the disease goes on. And so these things are going to be more and more common and prevalent as the disease progresses. Very large impact on quality of life. These things are the things that usually trigger the need for additional care. So when the non-motor symptoms become so severe that they need additional care, that usually precipitates, for example, moves into assisted living facilities or getting additional help. And of course, these things can impact personal relationships and finances. It's a significant source of caregiver burden as well. These are the things that caregivers and partners have a lot of trouble with because they're very difficult to deal with. So let's talk about mood first. And I'm going to start off with depression. As you can see, depression is very common in Parkinson's disease. As we saw earlier, about half of patients, maybe even more, have this feeling of depression or the syndrome of depression. Depression is a feeling of sadness or feeling blue or slow or down for at least 2 weeks. It's got to be present every day for at least 2 weeks. And it's manifest by changes in sleep and appetite. You may sleep more, you may sleep less. You may have a stronger appetite, you may have a weaker appetite. Decreased concentration and attention, increased fatigue, feeling slowed down, or possibly feeling restless or agitated. Feelings of worthlessness or guilt, and sometimes, and not always, but can often have feelings of not wanting to be alive anymore, or even suicidal ideas. Depression is more predictive of distress than the motor disabilities. So people who are depressed really have much more distress in their lives, and their quality of life is lower than their impact by the motor features of the disease. So depression is really an important factor that you need to pay attention to. We do know that it's more common in males, and in particularly people who have previous history of depression. The causes of depression, as we talked about earlier, are probably a combination of two factors. One is the biological factor. We talked about this. This is the presence or the lower levels of chemicals in the brain, which is a function of the disease. This is the disease happening. It's the biology of the disease. So depression is not something that you fall into. It's not something that you slip into or slide into. It's something that's biologically based for most people. That is, there's a deficit in the amount of chemicals in the brain, and it's causing this symptom. It's not something you do on purpose. And that's important for caregivers and spouses to know. But it's probably also a combination of those biological factors and also psychological factors. It's hard to cope with a major illness like Parkinson's disease. And this can cause people to become depressed and sad because they're coping with a major illness. There's also isolation that comes with depression, Parkinson's disease. You may have to retire early or restrict your activities because you can no longer do them, things that you might enjoy. And that can cause you to be sad and depressed. So depression is probably a combination of both of these things, but it's important to know that this is not something that people do willingly. This is not something where they're just going to sit around and feel sad and give up because they're doing it on purpose. This is biologically based, and it's important for people to know that. It's hard to recognize depression in Parkinson's disease because the symptoms of depression are very similar to the symptoms of Parkinson's disease. That is, when I read out the symptoms of depression, which are fatigue, feeling low, not feeling motivated and wanting to do things, looking like you're sad all the time, those are features of Parkinson's disease. And so it's hard to tease out if somebody's really depressed or if it's just Parkinson's disease, the motor symptoms. Also, some people have difficulty recognizing their own emotional states. They really can't tell. They're not very good about saying, I feel blank. So that might be a problem as well. So this is something we really need to pay attention to. The other major symptom I want to talk about with regard to mood is anxiety. Anxiety is a feeling of being tense or worked up, feelings of worry that last for 6 months or so. So this is not something that's just on a daily basis or sporadically, you know, one day you have it, the next day you don't. This is something where you always feel this way. It can be manifest by things like decreased concentration, feeling overwhelmed. You may have trouble with irritability. You might be on edge all the time. You might feel like just sort of worked up. This can be experienced as what we call generalized anxiety, meaning the anxiety is there all the time, every day, and there's no specific source. You just feel worked up. Or it can be anxiety attacks that come and go, and you get, for example, panic attacks. These can be one way that anxieties manifest. But it can also come out as things like obsessive compulsive disorder or social avoidance, that is, avoiding people, might be a symptom of anxiety. Again, if you think about those symptoms that I just read off to you of anxiety, they're very similar to the symptoms that you might experience with Parkinson's disease without anxiety. You might avoid social situations because you don't want people to see you shake. And that's probably a normal thing. And that doesn't mean that you're anxious. So it's really hard to tease out these symptoms from the normal symptoms, the motor symptoms of the disease, and these other non-motor features. This is why it's so critically important to talk to your doctor if you're feeling any of these things, because she will be able to tease that out for you in a detailed evaluation, or maybe sending you to an evaluation with someone like me who specializes in this. You can get a better feel for whether these are symptoms of anxiety or depression, or if they're symptoms of motor features of Parkinson's disease. Some of the things that you might be anxious about might be legitimate. It might not be anxiety. It might be that you are worried about falling because you fall, because you have motor symptoms of the disease. So again, it's really important for you to be speaking with your doctor about these symptoms, as disclosing as you can be with your treating physician is going to help you the best and get you the best quality of life. You need to be completely transparent, because even though some of these symptoms are hard to talk about, it's important that your doctor knows about them, because he or she can possibly do something. So maybe not, but maybe they can. So it's important to talk about that. Another feature that I want to talk about is not related to anxiety or depression, but rather is something called impulse control. And impulse control disorders are often seen in Parkinson's disease in association with specific medicines. There are some medicines that are used to treat aspects of Parkinson's disease that may give rise to impulse control disorders. Impulse control disorders are a problem controlling impulses that we all have. We all have impulses to do things, but most of the time our brains kind of push them down and say it's not appropriate for you to grab food off of somebody's plate. Even though I'm terribly hungry and I really want to do that, my brain says that's not socially appropriate. The dopamine and other chemicals in your brain are responsible for that repression, that pushing down that impulse. And without the dopamine, some of those impulses might come through and you might act upon them. Some examples are acting out without thinking, maybe doing things without thinking the thing through. It can express itself as hypersexuality, binge eating or drinking, compulsive behaviors like shopping, compulsive gambling, internet things, acting without thinking. All of these things are examples of impulse control disorders or impulse control problems. And it can be common with this particular drugs that are used. It may be very similar to things like OCD or addictive behaviors. These things are usually very upsetting to the patient's spouse, caregivers, and families. Sometimes also to the patient, but sometimes the patient isn't always aware of them. So these impulse control problems can happen in the absence of real awareness by the patient, but they're very upsetting to families. If someone is spending all of their money and gambling it away, or spending it on things that are useless or frivolous, the family can get really upset about that. And that's something that can cause a lot of friction. So again, this is something that if you notice these behaviors in yourself as a patient, or if you as a care partner notice these in your person with Parkinson's disease, it's important that you share that with your doctor. Okay, I want to talk briefly about hallucinations. This has received a lot of attention because there's new medicine out to treat these in Parkinson's disease. And it's a common, well, it's not terribly common, but it does happen. It does happen occasionally in people with Parkinson's disease. Roughly about a quarter to maybe a third of patients might experience these. Again, it's typically associated with a particular drug, but a hallucination is seeing, hearing, or maybe even feeling something that's not really there. So you're seeing something that, and these can be things that are formed, meaning they look like actual objects in the environment. It might be a dog, it might be small children, it might be an animal, it might be a deceased loved one that's not really there. So they actually look like the object that you're hallucinating. Sometimes hallucinations can be just visual movements, or they can be things in the environment like a flash that you thought you saw something that may or may not be a hallucination. It could be a visual misperception. But the important thing is that these things are typically benign in the sense that people don't tend to get terribly upset about them, but sometimes they do, and that's when it becomes a real problem, is when people see things that aren't real and then act upon them. And that's important and dangerous because sometimes acting to get away from something that's frightening, that's not really there, might cause the person to fall or get themselves into trouble in other ways. So seeing the object is not necessarily the problem, although it can be disturbing and frightening. It's the reaction to that can become a problem. It's important to tell your doctor about these things. Again, with everything that I'm saying today, if you're experiencing these symptoms, tell it to your doctor, because these might be related to medicines that you're taking, and those medicines can be stopped or another medicine be used. So it's important to inform your doctor about those. Okay, so I'm just going to do a quick check of time here. Okay, looks like we're good. I'm going to move now to cognition. So we've talked about mood and behavior. Cognition is thinking abilities. It's a word that we use to describe all of the different abilities that we as humans can do with our thinking. And this is everything from using language to speak and to communicate ideas, to understand our visual environments and the world around us so that we can navigate and walk around our homes and drive and all of those things, to planning, to complex emotional states and relationships that you might have, interacting with people, remembering things. All of these things fall under the term cognition. And this is the area that I particularly study, is how the brain produces these things. Cognitive changes in Parkinson's disease are very common, as we've heard about already. Up to 3/4 of individuals will experience some sort of cognitive change, mostly later in the course of the disease. And we're going to talk a little bit about dementia later, but dementia does not happen to everybody with Parkinson's disease. And it's important to know that not everybody with Parkinson's gets dementia or approaches the cognitive symptoms, but dementia is a cognitive syndrome that I'm going to talk about in a moment. But some people with Parkinson's do get a dementia. The primary issue with cognition in Parkinson's disease is the slowness of information transfer between those neurons in those large networks in the brain. So I told you in the biology lesson that there are these big networks that neurons talk to each other. Because the information transfer from one neuron to the next is slow, because there's the lack of dopamine in the brain, all of the resulting cognitive behaviors are slowed down. And you may experience these as a failure of that cognitive symptom, but it's really, if you look at it carefully, it's really a slowing of that information. I'm going to explain that in a moment. For most people with Parkinson's disease, memory loss, the ability to come up with information when you need it, word finding problems are the most troubling to patients. Those are the things that can be most difficult to manage because they're very frustrating. I'm going to go through the different cognitive domains that you see here listed on the slide in turn. So let's start with attention and processing speed. I've already told you that bradykinesia is a symptom, a slowing of movement, slow movement. Well, there's also something called bradyphrenia, and brady again meaning slow, phrenia meaning thinking. So bradyphrenia is a slowness of thinking that's exactly parallel to the slowness of movement that you experience. So as you reach for something and it goes very slowly, and you might have tremors that are making it difficult to make that movement. It's also the slowing of thinking. The information transfer of those neurons in the brain is causing a slowness of thinking abilities. And that's the primary problem in Parkinson's disease. This may result in a delay in responding when asked a direct question. You may know the answer, you may have it right there, but it just takes that extra half a second or 1 second or 2 seconds to get it out. That slowness is just the slowness of information moving through these neural circuits. It might take longer to complete specific tasks. It might take longer you might have difficulty sustaining attention over long periods of time, being engaged in a conversation for 20 minutes or so, and you might be able to just do it for 5 or 10. Executive function is the overall organization. Think of a chief executive officer of a company. Executive function is your individual ability to make decisions, to problem solve, to complete multi-step tasks, to do multitasking. All of these things fall under the domain of executive function. This is a problem because it relies on very fast information transfer. You have to think quickly in order to pull all the information together to solve a problem or to make a decision. People with executive dysfunction might show problems with impaired judgment or problems with impulse control. They don't think things all the way through. You might have difficulty initiating new tasks or behaviors. And again, this is because of that reduction in chemicals in the brain. This is a biologically based problem. So somebody who's amotivational or doesn't have motivation to do anything is not doing it on purpose most of the time, although I understand that that can happen. People are willful at times, but it's usually a problem with biology. So it's important for care partners to know that a person is not just sitting in her chair and doing nothing because she's being difficult. She has a biological problem with the chemicals in her brain that's causing her to be this way. And that's an important thing to know. One of the most common problems, cognitive problems in Parkinson's disease is something called tip of the tongue phenomena, which is that feeling that we've all had. Everybody has had this feeling where you know a word or you know what you want to say, and you can't get it out. And then you fuss over it and you try and harder, and it becomes more and more difficult. And then eventually you give up and you do something else, and then suddenly the word pops right into your head. That's called tip of the tongue phenomenon. It's a difficulty in retrieval of information. And again, this is just the slowing of information from neuron to neuron. It's just not getting to the motor output system as quickly as you need it. And so it's difficult to retrieve. Okay, let's talk about memory. And this is one that causes people problems and is very frustrating because memories are very essential to who we are as people. About half of people with Parkinson's disease are going to experience some memory difficulties or a change in their memories. And I want to make the point that the memory problem in Parkinson's disease is very different from the memory problem in, for example, Alzheimer's disease or amnesia, what we think of as amnesia. In Alzheimer's disease and in most amnesias, the problem is that you lose information, meaning you get information into the brain and then it goes away. You've lost it. In Parkinson's disease, the problem is a little bit different. The problem is typically a problem with getting information into the brain in an organized way or getting it out of the brain to use it. It's not because you've lost it. So it's really critical to know that because it can help caregivers and care partners to develop strategies to help someone with Parkinson's disease get the information that's still in the brain. They just need help getting it out or getting it in properly. In Alzheimer's disease, helping someone get the information out isn't going to work because it's not there anymore. They don't have the information anymore. In Parkinson's, it's different. The information is typically there. You just need help getting it out. Memory is a process. It's not a single thing, and you need to pay attention to information to encode it. You have to consolidate it and store it, and then you have to go and get it when you want it. So that's retrieval. Parkinson's is typically an encoding and a retrieval problem, not a storage problem. Alzheimer's is typically a storage problem. So it's important to know that. Now, dementia, so let's talk a little bit about that. This is more severe cognitive changes that significantly impact your ability to do daily tasks. So this is not just subtle changes in memory, tip of the tongue phenomena, maybe having some trouble remembering how to do multi-step tasks. This is more significant such that you can't do the things that you typically do during your day. You can't cook for yourself, you can't pay the bills. Those things might qualify for a diagnosis of dementia. And it's a more significant problem that is seen in Parkinson's disease. But it's important to know that not all patients with Parkinson's disease develop dementia. Some do. So it's very important for you, if you're experiencing any cognitive symptoms, to share those with your doctor, because dementia can be something that causes a lot of caregiver burden and stress, and it can be a problem for independent functional activities and living. So this is something you want to pay attention to. Tell your doctor if you're having troubles with your thinking abilities. So this last part of the talk is really to move away from the things that can go wrong to, well, what can we do about this? And there are a number of different things you can do. We are very active agents of our own cognitive health. We have opportunities to improve and to sustain our cognitive abilities. And I'm going to go through one of these. But here on this slide, you can see a number of these different things that you can do to improve your cognitive abilities. And these include, if you're being treated for a disorder like hypertension or elevated cholesterol, take your medicines to control these things to keep your body healthy. Stress reduction is critically important because when your brain is stressed, it doesn't work well. Physical activity, you're going to hear about that a lot today, and you already have, but physical activity does a lot of good things for the brain. So what's good for your heart and your cardiovascular system is also really good for your brain usually. So it's important to be physically active. Other lifestyle choices like tobacco use or alcohol use, head injuries, those things. Certainly diet is important, what you eat and how you nourish yourself. You have to get your body critical elements. But I'm going to talk today about mental activity, which your brain is not a muscle. This picture here on the slide is a little misleading. You can't, it doesn't work like a muscle necessarily, but you can make your brain work better. And you do that by stimulating neurons, those cells in the brain, to talk to each other a lot more and to talk to more of their neighbors. Mental activity, clearly, there's been decades, centuries of work on this. Mental activity does stimulate synapses to be formed. That's the connections between neurons. It stimulates and accelerates the rate of new brain cells and how they're created and formed. It strengthens synapses, and those networks become stronger so that they work more reliably and better. And it's certainly leisure activity that involves mental stimulation does decrease your risk of dementia as you get older. Mental activity is not, usually any mental activity that you do is going to be good for you, but there are some key principles that you want to keep in mind. One is novelty, and that is when you think about stimulating your brain and doing things actively, thinking, things that require thinking, it's got to be new. You've got to challenge it. Your brain doesn't like to do the same old thing all the time. So when you do new things, it encourages your brain to make new connections and diversify those cognitive networks that I talked about. You've got to change it up. Don't do the same thing every day. So not only does it have to be new, you got to do different things. So sometimes it might be a musical thing where you're listening to a new kind of music, and the next day you're doing crossword puzzles or reading a new book or learning a language. So you're going things from music to language to ideas and thoughts, and you've got to challenge yourself. So you can't just keep it at the same level. It's like working out at the gym. You've got to put on a little more weight every time because you're going to get better and you're going to get stronger, and you've got to challenge yourself to push yourself. It's important to do the things that you like. I'm not going to recommend, and nobody should tell you that you've got to do this X, Y, and Z in order to improve your brain. That doesn't work, because if you're doing something that you don't enjoy, you're less likely to do it. You're going to find ways to get out of it. So find something that you really like and then focus on that. So it might be, for example, here's a whole list of things that you might consider mentally stimulating and that you might enjoy. It might be just talking with friends and neighbors. These days you've got to do it over Zoom or on the telephone or whatever. But every time that you engage with somebody new, your brain is learning new things. You're considering different ideas. You're expressing yourself. All of those things encourage your neurons in your brain to work better and harder. I'm going to check on my time here. Okay, we've got a couple more minutes left. And things that we're doing today, for example, attending this Zoom conference. This is mentally stimulating. Hopefully, you're learning new ideas. You're seeing new faces that you can engage with, and visually you're challenging yourself. You're thinking about things. Maybe you're taking notes. You're thinking about planning about how you might change your treatment profile, or things that you've got to talk to your doctor about. Even things that we're doing right now are mentally stimulating. So these mental stimulation can be just about anything. I encourage people to try to learn something new every day. It might be a new word in the dictionary that you're going to try and use in conversation during the day. It might be a new concept. It's important to, instead of try and use your brain as a timer instead of your cell phone when you're out doing something. You know, everything that you do during the day is an opportunity for you to learn and to stimulate your brain. It's important to know that your brain does work better the more that you use it. If you want to remember something, the more that you call up that memory, the more that you remember that idea or that concept, the stronger its representation is in your brain, the longer you hold on to it. I'll bet you right now that most of you can think back all the way to childhood and think about the name of a teacher, your second grade teacher, your third grade, or your kindergarten teacher. And the way that we remember that is because that memory or that name, that association, has been brought up so many times over the course of our lives that the representation of that in the brain, the neurons that sort of make that memory work, are very strong. So every time you bring up a memory, it strengthens that association. So this is one of the reasons why we often can remember things from our remote past, but we can't really remember what we did yesterday or a couple of weeks ago, because we have more opportunity to practice those things. So the more that you practice things, the more that you reminisce, you engage with other people that have shared histories and experiences, the more you call up that trip to the Grand Canyon or whatever with your loved one, it strengthens that memory and makes it more permanent. So things you want to remember, you should practice. It's important too to pay attention when you want to remember something, because you've got to strengthen it when you get it in initially, that encoding, and then reduce distractions in order to facilitate retrieval. It's important to attend, visualize, and connect. These are 3 strategies that I use. For example, if you park your car in space 3B in the parking lot, and I know we're not doing that these days as much, but if you want to remember where your car is parked when you go into the grocery store, you might create a visual representation of 3 huge angry bees swarming over your car, and just imagine that. And that ridiculous sort of visual scene will help you remember, because it's unique, it's novel, and it's kind of crazy, but it's also not just verbal, it's visual as well. So you're bringing multi-modalities together to create this very rich memory. It'll help you hold on to that longer and better. You need to commit yourself when you remember people's names, when you're introduced. Often use it during the conversation or use it when you say goodbye. This is a big issue. For care partners, it's important to allow people to kind of go on their own when they're trying to remember things. It's not necessarily the best idea to jump right in and help them and finish off the sentence or finish off the word, or jump in and recall that memory or that information. Allow the person with Parkinson's to come up with it on their own. Again, it's probably still there. They're just having trouble retrieving it. There's a slowness in retrieving. So you need to be a little bit patient and allow them to do it. Certainly, if they come and it takes them an incredibly long time, you want to help them. But resist that initial urge to jump in and complete sentences for people. Give them the opportunity to do it for themselves. And it's important to use things like notes and keep things in routine places. Take-home points for today's talk: if you have non-motor symptoms, cognitive problems or mood problems, you need to share these with your doctor. She will be able to evaluate whether there's something to be concerned about, and if so, if there's something that can be done about them. So you need to be very transparent about these things. They're nothing to be ashamed of. They're nothing that you need to hide from people. Be open with your spouse, your care partner, and your doctor. Recognize that stress is very much related to these non-motor symptoms in both the patient and the care partner and caregivers. That most of the cognitive problems are related to slowing of information. Bradyphrenia, slow thinking; bradykinesia, slow movement. It's very much parallel to the motor symptoms you see. Keep your brain active with novelty, variety, and challenge. Focus on learning something new every day, and commit to using these memory strategies. It's going to help you get it done.